to Lake Iroquois to about Davenport Road. And then once that ice melted, the lake shrank and sank down to below its level currently. So in the circled area on the right, you can see a tiny Lake Ontario inside the boundary of the current Lake Ontario. And a lot of indigenous shorelines are actually underwater around Lake Ontario at the present day. But for those indigenous people and for those who still engage with the waterfront, the islands have always been significant and represented for them a place of healing and rejuvenation, and have hosted rituals as well as life-supporting activities. When we move into sort of recorded history, we start looking at early Hanlan's Point. And by Hanlan's Point at the time, in 1906 and for a while before, really what you had at that end of the Toronto Islands were two sandbars. One on the right called Hanlan's Point, and the one on the left called creatively the Western Sandbar. Looking at them a little more closely, Hanlan's Point evolved into an amusement park and sports area. On the right, the Western Sandbar was occupied with houses and cottages, as you can see in this 1910 map. And hotels on the island existed for quite a while, from 1833 and on. The most notable in the Hanlan's was Hanlan's Hotel from 1887 to 1905, when at that time it was destroyed by fire. Quite a substantial hotel, however. And it included also in the area an amusement park with a roller coaster and rides, roller skating, and the infamous diving horses that dove into what is now actually some of the runway area of the current airport. So all of the water that you see in behind here was the water between Hanlan's Point and the west sandbar, and that bridge you see running across was how people got over to sites and locations on the far west of the Western Sandbar. There were numerous sports facilities there. It started with the large lacrosse grounds and ended, I won't go through the stages of stadiums there, but ended with Maple Leaf Park, which stopped hosting the Toronto baseball team in 1927, but remained there as a stadium until 1937 with a capacity of 17,000. So it was big. And Maple Leaf Park was also the site of Babe Ruth's first professional home run. The Western Sandbar included beaches and still does, just a little further to the west of the Western Sandbar now, what we call Hanlan's Beach. And it was a popular swimming location. Also, if you took that bridge across to the Western Sandbar, you came to Turner's Baths, which were sort of an enclosed area of beach. When you see it from the beach side, Turner's Baths included docks, swimming areas, water slide, and bathhouses that you can sort of see in the trees there, entranceways into change rooms and so forth. A little to the south of Hanlan's Point also was the Lakeshore Home for Children. And sort of in keeping with that history of the islands being restorative, the Lakeshore Home for Children was set up for treating sick children on the island. And of course, if you think about waterfront and spas, you can look at the Therm Spa proposed for Ontario Place, where people will be safe from touching the water in any way possible. The residences on the west sandbar included a boardwalk in front of them, and to the right you see is lake, which would actually be lake that would look out over towards Ontario Place today. And seen from the Hanlan's Point Lighthouse or landmass, you're looking at the backs of those buildings, so you're facing west across that waterway between the two sandbars. That waterway was a popular rowing venue for rowing races, and of course rowing history for Hanlan's was also connected to Ned Hanlan, the famous Canadian rower. Aviation happened on Hanlan's Point almost from the time of aviation period, and Curtis, an airplane manufacturer, had a school of flying located on the Hanlan's Point, in fact, and they would go around through the Western Gap and fly off the western beaches. And there was no airport in Toronto at the time, so flying into and out of Toronto was a marine operation until the opening of the island airport. At that point, lake filling created the current island airport, and this shot kind of shows everything. This is Hanlan's Point and the western sandbar in 1919, and I've drawn for reference the location of the diving horses there with the red arrow. You can also see the roller coaster as a part of the amusement park here, and in the background of the diving horses here, and some of the other events and locations in the amusement park area throughout there. The ferries came in and docked where they dock today, the Hanlan's Point ferries, and the ballpark here, of course. So in 1919, you can see the natural landmass in its form before the airport began. What you can also see is the newly formed Western Gap here. This is still the route of the Western Gap today, but that was put in 1910. There is the National Yacht Club in its next to current location right there. The lake filling that occurred to create the airport happened over several years, but filled in both the gap between the western sandbar and Hanlan's Point, and extended the western sandbar outwards into shallow water here. This shot is taken from above and looks southward from, it might have been the grain elevators, but it might have been from an airplane, I'm not sure. What you can see here, though, is the western sandbar is marked here by trees, and you can still see some of the houses in here. But in front of them and between them and the lake now is a wholly largely newly filled landmass that has been poured in preparation for the airport. And off in the background here, you can still see the roller coaster. It was defunct, but still standing at that time, 1937. And when it opened, this is what the airport looked like. The ferry docks at Hanlan's are still there. A newly formed landmass was graded and leveled, and runways were built. And of course, the ferry ran, as it still does, between the land and the city side right here. And what this sort of leads to recognizing is that the original landmass of those two sandbars, marked here in green as B and C, encroach into the current property of the island airport and become a part of the legal structure of the current lease at the airport, because those two pieces of land are still owned by the city. The yellow areas are owned by what's now the Port Authority. It was the Toronto Harbor Commissioners at the time. And two little patches at the ends here are federal lands. So what you have in the governance of the current airport is a tripartite agreement. And that agreement ends in 2033, which will be the bulk of what we're talking about tonight. But all the way through were visions of what the airport might be, or what those lands might be if they weren't an airport. And some of those were shaped by the geography of the area, because the Toronto lands, the island and the outer harbor headland, the Leslie Street Spit and the port lands and so on, all sit on shallow land, shallow water, in shallow water. And proposals concerning development are governed a little bit by that geography, underwater geography. One proposal was this one. Harbor City would have built into the harbor airport, into the airport lands, would have taken away the Western Gap, built south of the CNE, where Ontario Place is currently, and created a new western channel running out through from Blockhouse Bay into the harbor. So if you were into the lake, so if you're going between the inner harbor and the lake, you're taking a route that doesn't exist today. And the island airport would be located on newly filled land to the south of the current islands, but again, still in the shallow water, as you can see by the bathospheric lines here. Another idea would have put the island airport out in the portlands, kind of where the outer harbor is now, or on the Leslie Street Spit, where there was a suggested location for a short takeoff and landing airport. This was a concept that really was that the airport would be limited in a number of ways and would be a short takeoff and landing airport. On the west, on the Leslie Street Spit. The Leslie Street Spit is not that shape, but the idea was there. This area, marked recreational area, never was filled. And of course, all of the area in here is configured completely differently now. Much of the inner harbor would have been filled in here, and this area would have been, again, Harbor City, kind of Toronto's Venice with canals running through.
Ron,
yes,
there was a question in the chat about, I know on the ownership chart, what was the purple on the ownership chart?
The purple was Toronto Port Authority. It still is Toronto Port Authority land that is outside of the airport perimeter.
Ah, thank you.
Yeah, so that is actually, I mean, if you were to walk there, you wouldn't know that you were changing political jurisdictions, but you would still not be inside the airport. Here's one of the Harbor City concepts here, and it includes a bridge over the Western Gap, and that bridge would actually have been sort of a southward extension of Bathurst Street, winding through an area now that is populated with condominiums and co-ops, and across into a newly developed area that would be occupying what the current airport lands are. Here's another Harbor City concept without the bridge, and those concepts didn't pass through the political process. But there were other forward visions too and discussions of the future. In 1989, for example, David Crombie hosted the Royal Commission on the Future of the Toronto Waterfront. And specifically regarding the airport, it's probably just worth looking at the notes here to say, at that point, no deputants at the Royal Commission hearings advocated physical expansion of the airport or lengthening of its runways. However, a former chief engineer of the Toronto Harbour Commission proposed that the airport be located on the Leslie Street spit, which would be enlarged by dredging. The proposal did not receive any support from other deputants. Metro Councillor Dale Martin suggested the possible elimination of the airport and looking at it as a non-conforming use on the waterfront. And others requested a freeze on expansion until such time as definitive criteria have been established for the size of the terminal and until issues of access and location have been resolved and an overall land use zoning plan established. That's work still pending in many ways. Other forward visions include the idea of the Toronto Island Solar Wind Park. This one was put forward by Jerry Engler, a landscape architect at the Daniels Faculty of Landscape Architecture and Design at the U of T. Here what you see is something recognizably in shape the same as the airport lands today, but not an airport. It includes things like meadows, sports fields, a healing circle, and gardens, walkways, and public space in general. Here's another view of the same, drawn by Jerry Engler. Thank you. And I think that just sort of is to frame the discussion for tonight.
Thank you very much, Ron. If you could, thank you so much. Well, I'd like to actually welcome a whole bunch more people who've just joined us. And I also have to confess, sort of as if we were in the TV studio where you're in a live audience and they stop you and go, hang on a sec, we got to refilm that part because the magician didn't get the rabbit out of the hat. So if you'll bear with me, I'm just going to very quickly, and for the benefit of those who've joined us since we started, I'm just going to very, very briefly reintroduce this evening. So in terms, we do of course record these things, and I say there was a glitch in our cloud recording. I had an error message on that, and I had to restart the recording. So if we put this up, as we do, we put recordings of our events up on our website at waterfrontforall.ca. It will be a cold open for Ron, and Ron is quite capable of handling a cold open. So again, welcome again to Up in the Air. It's time to talk about the future of the Island Airport lands. We are talking about this because the tripartite agreement that governs the airport ends in 2033. And one thing Waterfront for All is committed to is that we have a thorough and fulsome discussion about how we dispose of the lands, whether it be an airport or something else, entirely. That for the 50 years from the 2030s out to the 2080s, and of course long after many of us will have long since gone to our reward. And that was Ron Jenkins, board member for Waterfront for All, avid sailor, and as you could see, someone who is well versed in the history of the waterfront, in particular the Island Airport and adjacent areas. We are joined also by Ed Hore, the chair of Waterfront for All this evening, who is had a leading role in the successful No Jets campaign, which many of you would be familiar with. Brian Iler, who is a longtime nonprofit sector lawyer, a lead in the ongoing success of Hughes Room, member of Community Air, and of course a member of Parks Not Planes. And Sanford Borins, professor emeritus of strategic management at U of T, and a distinguished author of many, many books on public sector innovation. And despite officially retiring just a few years ago, he continues to actively participate in public discourse, writes many blogs, and you can find him at sanfordborins.com. And we're thrilled to have him with us this evening. And again, for those of you who missed it, I think it's certainly worth, if you'll bear with me, redoing our land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we are meeting on the land that is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. And I'm pleased to, I'm going to go now back to our regularly scheduled programming. And yes, by the way, the Leafs have scored a goal in the first period, for those of you who care. So hope is not entirely lost, or hope is just, the crushing of your hopes is delayed for a few minutes, depending on how you want to interpret that. I'd like to acknowledge that we have Nora Cole with us this evening from Deputy Mayor Malik's office. Nora's going to be listening to and taking notes on what we say this evening. I'm also pleased to say that we have Brian Bowen with us this evening. His role at the City of Toronto is now to act as the city's lead on the forthcoming Billy Bishop Toronto Centre Airport RISA review process. As part of this role, he's attending to listen this evening, and he has asked me in particular, as your host and moderator, to please do not ask direct questions to him at this time. Brian is here in listening and learning mode. But the City of Toronto will be launching a fulsome outreach and consultation on questions regarding the future of the Island Airport and the RISA, which we'll learn more about in a moment. That effort, in planning that effort, they are in direct consultation with Nicole Swerin, who many of you know, and third-party public, as they develop an outreach program to tackle questions pertaining to the future of the Island Airport. So I'd just like to welcome Brian and Nora here this evening. And again, please respect the fact that they are not here this evening. They're here to listen. They're not here to answer questions. So thank you very much for your kind understanding on that. And we'll be going to Ed Hore next. But just before we do, I want to show you a couple of pretty pictures. And I'm going to be interspersing this in our conversations. This is Santa Monica Airport. It is scheduled to close forever in 2028. A number of concepts have already worked out for what it could look like. It could look something like this, or it could look something like this. So just to show you, and I'm going to share a couple of other examples along the way, and some of our speakers may also refer them in passing as well, that downtown or airports at the center of cities or towns are not necessarily there forever. So please welcome Ed Hore, chair of Waterfront Toronto, and Ed.
Okay, thanks.
I'm just going to spotlight you here.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. All right. There you go.
Yeah. I don't have all these fabulous graphic aids like Ron did and like Edward does. I just have one slide, and here it is. And the reason is that I think it's important for people to understand kind of why we're talking about this now, because 2033 seems like kind of a long time away. However, it appears that in fact the decision might have to be made really pretty soon what to do about the Island Airport. And the reasons for that are a little bit complicated, but here's our understanding of it. We're not privy exactly to what the city's up to, but this is sort of as far as we can gather, this is the situation. Many of you will know that there have to be runway end safety areas built at the end of the runways by, as I understand it, Q2 2027. So about 3 years from now. These can take various forms. There are a number of options. However, some of those options, most of them perhaps, and the ones that it appears Ports Toronto would like to implement, do involve lake fill and have quite a high estimated cost. The Ports Toronto essentially put it up for sale and and issued some information in 2021, and it estimated the cost of complying with these new regulations, the RISA regulations, at 50 million to 130 million. That was in 2021. It seems very likely that construction costs have increased since then. So we're talking about a large ticket item. And we're talking also about a pretty large scale project, and it's got to get approved, not only by Transport Canada and also by the city. The city, by virtue of the tripartite agreement, has the ability to approve it, particularly if it has some kind of lake fill component. And so to get it all approved and actually built and up and running in 3 years, they're going to have to move along pretty fast. Now, here's the snag. They don't have enough money, as far as we know, to get it done. There are financial statements put out by Ports Toronto about once a year, and they don't have that kind of money around. So they're going to have to borrow it or get an investor interested. And the first question that any such person is going to ask is going to be, well, what's going to happen about the expiry of the tripartite agreement? 2033 is only 9 years away. A large piece of infrastructure like that generally would require, let's say, 50 years or maybe even 75 years to amortize, to pay off the loans. Basically, they're going to be required. There's some other work as well involved or required at the runways in years to come, as I understand it. So there's a pretty considerable investment that's got to be made, and the money's got to come from somewhere. So where's it going to come from? So the city, as I understand it right now, is kind of waiting to see what exactly Ports Toronto wants to do. And they have said that they're looking very carefully at the process and how they will consider it. And I think the nature of the process and the scope of it is going to depend a lot on what exactly Ports Toronto wants. But if, as part of that, they were to say, which is right now, as far as we know, hypothetical, but if they were to say, and in order to get this RISA thing done, we're going to need an extra 50 years or some extended period to amortize the loans that we're going to need, then we, I hope, would be into a quite extensive discussion, which would not be limited necessarily to RISA and what about the fish habitat and what will it look like and do, what effect will it have environmentally and all that kind of stuff, but may well be a much more sweeping kind of a discussion, which would involve the fundamental issue of whether, in fact, the airport should continue to exist past 23, because the tripartite agreement doesn't have any terms in it for automatic renewal. There's got to be a positive step by the signatories to create a new agreement or extend it on some basis somehow or other. And so it could be that this big discussion about what are we going to do with these 210 acres is going to be upon us very soon. And I don't think that that's widely understood. So this question about what should happen down there, and do we like it? Do we need an airport? Should we consolidate operations at Pearson? What are the effects on, increasing density? We've already got Up Express. All of that, I have advocated to the city. If there is a discussion ultimately about renewal, and if it's soon, then there's going to have to be a very wide-ranging discussion, I believe, which would be limited to, of course, not only the RISA issue, but the bigger issue of, do we fundamentally need to have an airport, or should we consolidate airport functions basically at Pearson? There's some indication that Porter, the principal tenant, is leaving. It's certainly moved a lot of its flights to Pearson recently. It's also complained in litigation with Ports Toronto that it costs about 3 times as much to operate out of Billy Bishop Airport. So there may be economic reasons why it's simply not viable. There's a lot of environmental complaints that we probably don't need to get into. There's noise issues. There's a lot of issues. It's a complicated issue. And so it may be that all of those complicated issues are going to have to be explored, and we're going to have to be looking at, well, do we really want it? Do we need it? What are the other things that we could do? All of those, I think, are worth discussing. And that's partly why we want to have this event, is we want to get people thinking about it, and how are we going to talk about it? What are the sort of studies and things that we're ultimately going to need in order to make the best decision for the city? Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Ron. Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. And, you know, it's interesting because in the chat, somebody said Berlin. Someone said
yeah.
Berlin. And I'm always interested in people saying Berlin. So Berlin. So Berlin has an airport that is now being decommissioned and has been is in the process of being used for a combination industry, tech, residential, and park space. So this is an example of the former airport and what is in progress. And for there's also, I'm going to share. I'm going to share some of the links in the chat so people can see these things as well. So if you check the chat, so that's that. And now I'd like to turn to the lovely and talented Brian Iler. Brian, I'm just going to find your. I think this would be their thing. Hang on, let me just spotlight you here. And I'm just going to do this and add a spotlight for you. Spotlight for everyone, for you. And we'll just view the slideshow here, okay? Hang on, slideshow. Hang on, view. All right, why is it being difficult? Why, today of all days, is it being difficult?
You're not in the slideshow, I don't think.
Oh, where am I here?
Slideshow up there.
Oh, yeah. Where?
See slideshow?
Ah, there we go.
There.
Yeah, it's still not doing what I want it to do. But I guess is that can you see that satisfactorily?
Well, we can see it pretty well.
Okay, great.
You want to get started?
Yep, go for it, Brian.
Oh, yep, thanks. Well, a group of us formed Parks Not Plains several years ago to pursue conversion of the island airport lands to parkland, and actually desperately needed parkland when it ceases to be an airport. In so doing, we expect that the advantages of that conversion will lead to a decision to close the airport sooner than later, if not in 2027, the deadline for RISAs, as Ed talked about, but in 2033 when the lease from the city expires. And second slide, please. And this is the same plan you saw from Ron. We talk about the tripartite agreement. It's essentially a lease of the green areas from the city to Ports Toronto. The lease expires in 2033. The Ports Toronto pays $1 a year for lease of those lands to the city. As Ed noted, there's no right of renewal. Note that all of the yellow lands were Toronto Harbour Commission lands given to the Toronto Harbour Commission by the City of Toronto back in 1911 for free, as we understand it. And then the Port Authority, or Ports Toronto, was established in the late 1990s and handed all those lands for free. So it's a bit odd for Ports Toronto to be selling lands that it owns at fair market value, as it just did with the Parliament Street slip. Something close to $20 million was paid for by, I understand, Waterfront Toronto to Ports Toronto. So Ed's spoken about the timelines for decision on the island airport. As we know, the ball has been in Ports Toronto's court for some time, and given the increasingly tight time frame for it to meet the 2027 deadline, we at Parks Not Plains are frankly shocked that Ports Toronto has proceeded in such a lackadaisical fashion. We need and expect to see a comprehensive public consideration of all the issues around the airport: economic, planning, environmental, safety, and above all, the public interest. we have an opportunity to thoroughly examine what the best use of those magnificent 215 acres of lands should be. Fundamentally, the fact that these lands are public assets and the airport is operated by a public agency necessarily implies that the public interest is a key determinant for how these lands are used and how one plans for their future use. We've been here before. Next slide. Sorry, we skipped that one. Next slide. Yeah, Community Air was formed back in 2003 to pursue closure of the airport, relying on statements from the Port Authority that a bridge to the airport was essential for safety, and the airport would have to shut down without a bridge and without expansion. This is from a press release on October 16, 2003. Lisa Raitt, who was then the CEO of the Port Authority, said this: the fixed link, meaning the bridge, is a public safety issue. The need for a bridge to get emergency equipment to the airport quickly was identified by an intergovernmental committee almost 10 years ago. In the event of an emergency, it could take up to 2 hours to get the appropriate equipment over to the island, and that's not acceptable. Well, we have that study, and it clearly says up to 40 or 50 emergency vehicles need to be at the site of a crash within 20 minutes. And so what happened? We won the fight, the bridge was stopped, but the expansion went ahead anyway. Question is why? There's never been another study that assures us that alternatives now exist to ensure an adequate emergency response. We've asked. Next slide. The runway end safety areas are another safety issue that has been long ignored by Transport Canada and Ports Toronto. The urgency of addressing their inadequacy was demonstrated by this Air France excursion and off the runway in 2005 at Pearson. In response to this, and unfortunately no one was killed in this. It's amazing that that's true. In response to this, the Transportation Safety Board recommended 300-meter recess. Excursions like this are not a remote possibility. Transport Canada says over a 20-year period, there were 268 excursions, 148 of which were commercial aircraft. Transport Canada, after dithering for years, is finally imposing a 150-meter requirement on the island airport in 2027. As Ed noted, that will require filling in some of the harbor and the bay. How are they going to find that money? Ports Toronto has anguished about that in a submission to Transport Canada. I think the next slide, Ed. Yeah, given that the tripartite agreement is scheduled to expire in 2033, the commercial availability of financing for the RESAs is seriously impaired, since there would be approximately 14, that was 5 years ago, now it's 9, years to amortize this project, which is very short for a project of this magnitude. So the expiry of the tripartite agreement 9 years away puts the lease renewal on the agenda to enable financing to be found to pay for the RESAs. Next slide. RESAs are more important at the island airport than at other airports, as right off the end of the runway is deep water. This is a picture of US Airways Flight 1549 forced to land on the Hudson River on January 15, 2009. If Ports Toronto was serious about complying with the 2027 RESA requirement and addressing a serious safety risk, the inadequate RESAs, why has it failed to come up with any details of their plans or commence the public debate on the value of spending that kind of money? Time is running out. Next slide. Part of our successful fight against the bridge back in 2005 was an effort to imagine what a better use of the airport lands might be. Architect Tom Basai has proposed opening up the lagoons and waterways to reflect the original island lands before they were filled in for the airport. He suggested 5 zones. Next slide. Zone 1 expands the existing Hanlan's Beach and dunes right up to the Western Gap. Another 825 meters of beach and dunes, now hard to access because one has to go around the southerly end of the airport lands. Next slide. Zone 2, he suggests, would be marsh and wetlands, providing important habitat to an array of plants, birds, insects, amphibians, fish, and other animals, including many species at risk. Next. Zone 3, active recreation and markets, analogizing to Vancouver's hugely successful Granville Island, repurposing existing buildings, a soccer field, several baseball diamonds, lots of green space. Next slide. Zone 4, a feature site, the best site in the city for a major iconic structure, like the Sydney Opera House. An indigenous center, perhaps? Next slide. Zone 5 could have accommodation and restaurants, reflecting the hotel and entertainment facilities Ron talked about that existed there up to the 1930s. So Tom's full presentation is available on the Bathurst Key Neighborhood Association website. These are ideas meant to stimulate discussion and creativity. The ideas help us to imagine the possibilities once the airport is gone. And they help us frame the impending discussion on whether the airport should shut down. So I'll pass the floor on to Ed, who's going to talk more, I think, about, or Edward, about what other cities that have shut down or are shutting down their city center airports. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Brian. Yes, well, someone mentioned, someone in the chat mentioned Downsview. So let's, I think some of you may well be familiar with Downsview. So let's see. So Downsview, of course, looks like, did I actually remember? So Downsview, of course, is an airport, and commercial airport, and was a once upon a time military airport. And many of you may know that it is currently in the process of being redeveloped. And these are some of the concept drawings for what it could look like. So part of it includes an expansion and connections to the existing Downsview Park. Part of it is will feature what you see on the slide: residential development, mid-rise development. There's also some consideration for some high-rise that are at the edges, because as many of you know, there are 3 subway stops within the area of the Downsview precinct. But this is obviously a radical change, and also the area adjacent to on the east side of Downsview, on the east side of the Allen Road, is also going through a redevelopment, primarily residential focused. It's basically right now empty land south of the subway station at Shepherd and Allen, and to the east of the park of the Downsview area. So again, this is an example of what can happen to an airport. Many of you some of you may know that the old Edmonton City Center Airport, which used to look like this, was shut down and has been this is an example of what it used to look like, and it's been turned into the neighborhood of Blatchford. Now, Blatchford is a work in progress. There have been some. If you look at on Google, you'll see that there have been some fierce words exchanged about the progress of the transformation. But it is underway and it is exciting, and it will at some in the fullness of time. It will also have an LRT stop. And this is a concept a concept plan, which is in part built out. Part of it has been built out of what that area could look like. So if I just go look at that and look at that. So again, these are examples of areas that are going to be primarily residential, commercial, urban focused. However, again, it underscores what Brian just said, that when we think about airport lands that may or may not be necessary to the future, growth or prosperity or transportation needs of the city. I also want to remind people too of something that when we think about the 2030s, now I know we're all kind of like, going, will the Eglinton Crosstown ever actually be finished? And I know my 17-year-old asked me that question every time we pass Eglinton. But, I think eventually it will be, and there will be additional connections. The Up Express will be electrified. There will, Pearson, to its credit, has a proposal. It's pushing forward for a major multimodal transportation link, a kind of Union Station Northwest at the airport, at Pearson Airport. There will, the BRT line to the airport from Mississauga City Center will, in the fullness of time, be transformed into an LRT. So Pearson will have, over the next 20 years, Pearson will be adding somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 to 5 new transit connections of various types. So in terms of access, that's something to keep in mind. So with no further ado, I'd like to stop that right now. And I would like to, I'm just going to ask Sanford to unmute himself, and I will spotlight Sanford and ask distinguished Professor Emeritus Sanford Borins to talk to us. Thank you very much, Sanford.
Thank you. I want to explain how I got interested in Billy Bishop Airport and provide something of a historical parallel. 50 years ago, I wrote my dissertation on the economics of airport planning. Economics dissertations usually have a theoretical and an empirical component. For mine, the empirical component was the federal government's plan to build a second Toronto International Airport, mainly for overseas flights, in Pickering. Analytically, it was clear that it was a bad proposal. It inconvenienced passengers with longer trips to the airport, and it required some passengers to connect between airports. And it spread aircraft noise and pollution to a quiet semi-rural area that was part of the GTA. Well, if the analytics were clear-cut, the politics were quite messy, and I studied the politics. The airports were then seen by the business community as pork barrel politics. So if Montreal was getting a second airport at Mirabel, Toronto's business community wanted a second airport also. I interviewed Jean Marchand, who some of you may remember. He was the transport minister at the time and a lifetime colleague of Pierre Trudeau. Marchand told me that he didn't want to be the French-Canadian minister accused of denying Toronto its second airport. That said, why wasn't the Pickering Airport built? Well, there was a strong wave of citizens' opposition to building an airport in primarily a rural area. Ontario's PC party government, headed by Premier Bill Davis, listened. Davis told the federal government that the province wouldn't build access roads to the Pickering Airport, and that effectively killed the project. So Bill Davis killed Pickering. He also killed the Spadina Expressway that was supposed to go to end at the Gardiner Expressway. On the other hand, Davis oversaw a major expansion of Ontario's universities and colleges. So he was a conservative premier who was enthusiastic about intellectual infrastructure, but not about transport infrastructure. You might say he's the complete opposite of the current PC party government. Given the study I did of Pickering long ago, it seemed natural to me to have a look at Billy Bishop. One thing that's clear is that the airport duplicates Pearson in the sense that you can fly to every destination from Pearson that you can fly to from Billy Bishop. But the opposite isn't true. There are lots of destinations you can fly to from Pearson, but not from Billy Bishop. The scale of the two airports is entirely different. There were 45 million passengers at Pearson in 2023, and only 2 million passengers at Bishop. Not only that, but traffic at Bishop hasn't been increasing over the last decade. One key reason for this is the Union Pearson Express, which has increased the convenience of using Pearson for people who live downtown and who might otherwise have wanted to use Bishop. So what's the impact of Billy Bishop? What is it good for? It provides a slight increase in convenience for downtown residents at the cost of considerable aircraft noise and pollution in a part of the city that is primarily residential, commercial, and recreational. Well, what would happen if Billy Bishop closed and the 2 million passengers shifted to Pearson? There'd be a major decrease in pollution on the waterfront, with only a slight increase in pollution in the area around Pearson, which is mainly industrial. And the land on the island could be put to much better use, as we've already been discussing this evening. The supporters of Bishop talk about its so-called economic benefits, which are generally calculated as a multiple of the wages paid to people who work at Bishop, and that turn out to be something on the order of $5 billion. Well, if the traffic moved, if these 2 million passengers moved to Pearson, then these jobs would move to Pearson. And so the economic benefits of Billy Bishop wouldn't be lost to the GTA, they'd just be relocated. I want to finish with a word about Richard Florida, whom you may have heard of. Richard Florida is a professor of urban studies at the Rotman School, and he's been one of the big proponents of Billy Bishop. Being a colleague at a university isn't the same as being a colleague in politics. We owe each other no organizational allegiance. Our only allegiance is to the truth as we see it. Florida has done important work on what he calls the creative class, and he's argued that cities that create research-oriented jobs, or what used to be called white-collar jobs, are ultimately the most successful cities. And in his research and his writings, he discusses how to lure those types of jobs to cities. But somewhere along the way, Florida came up with the cockamamie idea that cities attract these jobs by having lots of airports, and that the cities with the most airports have the most urban mojo. So that's why he's so enamored of Billy Bishop and wants to keep it going. With respect, I think Richard Florida is putting the cart before the horse. Transportation infrastructure should serve the people of the city, not the other way around. And in my view, Billy Bishop Airport isn't serving the people of Toronto very well at all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sanford. You know, I thought about this a while ago when I remember about 30 years ago, I was involved with a group of people who were trying to save the old poultry market space, or poultry factory slash continuingly to be failed market on Queen Street West. Some of you may know it. And one of the people in our group said, well, even after the revolution, the leaders of the anarcho-syndicalist, collective will want to fly out of Billy Bishop Airport because they all live downtown and they can walk over to it. And I suppose if you live steps away from it, it does have a certain appeal. But as you pointed out, Sanford, that's a small percentage of people, to whom that's true for. So we've come to the end of our formal presentation, and we happy to take questions. Now there are 130 plus of us, so hopefully if you raise your hand, I'll see you, or alternatively, you can put your question in the chat and I am happy to relay it. So who would like to pose a question? Please, if you want, hi, Janice. Okay, Janice, I'm going to ask you to unmute. Hi, Janice.
Hi, how are you?
And Janice, to whom would you like to pose your question?
Can be the whole panel.
Okay,
First,
the whole panel.
I'd like to talk about carbon neutral. Currently, there's no way to fly anywhere on a carbon neutral, and supposedly in 2040 we're going to be carbon neutral, and nobody's offering any solutions yet. So aren't airports going to decline in importance? So why are we trying to keep this one open? And I had another question, but I lost it. So just answer the how are we going to get to carbon neutral? Air travel has to go down. It just has to.
Janice, I totally agree. The climate crisis is something we don't really quite appreciate how dire it is. And certainly, if we're going to continue to move around, we can't use airplanes nearly as much as we do now. And if that's so, then there's certainly less and less of a need for an airport or spending $50 to $130 million on an airport that has a very limited life if we're going to deal effectively with the climate crisis. There are no aircraft that are zero emission. They fantasize about hydrogen, they fantasize about electric aircraft. Not going to happen. It's decades away, if ever. It'll take a revolution in battery technology for electrics to happen. They have to be so much lighter than they are now, and so on.
Any other comments, Ron, Sanford, or Ed? No, okay. Pam, is that Pam Massa? Hi, Pam. Can you unmute yourself? Okay. Oh,
Sorry.
there you are.
Sorry.
No worries. Hi, Pam.
Hi. All really interesting stuff. I hope it's the beginning of a long talk at City Hall. I'm just wondering, I know Ports Toronto has hung on to this place with determination, and the reason that they developed the airport was because they needed the money, and they weren't making any money as a port. And so if the airport closes, how is this land that's run by the Port Authority going to be, where is it? Who's going to own it? Who's going to run it? Who's going to run the port? Because there is some things that need to be done unless we take it out of the federal jurisdiction. But I'm just wondering, what's going to happen if this airport closes to Ports Toronto, and how much leverage they've got with the federal government to hang on to this land?
It's certainly something that we need to be focusing on the federal government for. The lands were taken from the Harbor Commission and put into the hands of the Port Authority by an act of Parliament. And we will need another act of Parliament to transfer those lands out of the hands of the Port Authority and into the hands of whatever organization, the city or Waterfront Toronto, or whatever would run the new use of those lands. We do know that the Hamilton Port Authority also runs the Oshawa Port, and they could easily run the rather slender operations of the Toronto Port. We also know that the Outer Harbour Marina, which is the third business unit for Ports Toronto, is hugely expensive for boaters and makes a huge profit, which pays all those huge salaries in the head office at Ports Toronto. If that was taken and given into the hands of someone who had operated on a not-for-profit basis, we'd see the cost to voters significantly decline and make that facility much more accessible to people without the means that they have to have at this point.
Any other comments on what happened, disposition of the land?
I guess I'll add, Pam, that one of the characteristics of Ports Toronto has been that it has a history of selling off legacy land in order to finance itself. So, for example, it sold off its headquarters, the old Harbor Commissioner's building and surrounding parking lot, for $96 million some years ago, and it can declare land surplus, sell it off, and then it appears keep the money because it kept the money itself and didn't turn it over to the federal treasury. There would, if the airport were to change, I believe that the city would have to enter into high-level discussions with the federal government about on what basis would land be transferred. I mean, presumably it just simply would not make any sense for 210 or 215 acres of prime land, perhaps the most valuable land, in the country, to be sold by an entity, Ports Toronto, which would then simply, put the money in its own bank account, not use it in the public interest. So I think it would be clear to everyone, I hope, that in some way that that can happen, cannot happen, and there has to be some other arrangement made. But what that arrangement would be right now is a bit hard to predict.
So there is some history on 30 Bay, which was where the property that was sold by Ports Toronto for $96 million. Adam Vaughan, to his credit, when he was an MP, fought very, very effectively to try to persuade the federal liberal government to have those $96 million paid into Treasury to the federal government and not allow Ports Toronto to keep the money. Unfortunately, Adam lost that fight. And there's another fight to be had if they are continuing to do this, as they just did with the Parliament Street slip. Sold that for $19.3 million, and we think they pocketed that. So there's cash they're sitting on, and for what use? It's a public agency. This is a public asset. They do no consultation on how they spend it, and they seem to be simply using it to cover their deficits.
There was also a question about whatever became of the federal government's review of port authorities.
We made a submission in it, and the answer, so far as I know, is nothing. I never heard a thing about it. I just don't know what became of it. If anybody has other information,
Community Air also made a submission, and we've heard nothing. I know other organizations, the Nanaimo Port Authority, their opposition group submitted a similar brief to the one that Waterfront for All and Community Air did. Nothing happened. There's no political will in Ottawa to reform port authorities as they should be.
Well, I'd like to add about federal governments that Poilievre made a YouTube video about a year ago advocating expanding the runways at Billy Bishop to bring in jets. So one wonders if he's elected, if he'll if he'll honor that promise, or if he may be convinced that it was a rash promise. But that's sort of something to bear in mind.
I would say that, in fact, he doesn't have the power to do that unilaterally. And the technical requirements for airspaces around airports changed in 2015. And the feasibility of expanding to make that airport suitable for jets of the sort he's talking about doesn't exist any longer. The airspace requirements are different, and the building constraints are different, and the city core is building. What supported the idea of the Porter proposal in 2013 was already thin, but is now, I think, just technically not feasible.
We might have something like an episode of Yes Minister in which the public servants prevail.
So, Ron, just to dig into that a little bit more. So that would obtain even if the feds tried to expropriate, which I suppose ultimately they could presumably prevail if they tried to expropriate the entire island airport lands.
Well, the requirements for the space around an airport are defined by the Transport Canada regulations, specifically TP 312, and that regulation defines things like takeoff surfaces, and the newest TP 312 regulation is part of what's pushing the need for runway and safety areas, but also takeoff surfaces now are supposed to be able to enable a plane to take off safely with one engine operating. And for that to happen, you have a much flatter takeoff. And that brings constraints on the development of the portlands as far as building height goes. And also, you can see already the central waterfront buildup is continuing apace.
Right. Oh, we've got a question here. Given the dominance of residential development promoted by our present premier, how can we be assured the area will be used for public purpose and environmental support? The city has been reminded the province controls cities and an MZO could authorize development there. Well, I'm going to take a first crack at that. I mean, as far as gentlemen, you can correct me if I'm mistaken, but as far as I understand, a significant chunk of the airport is in Island Airport is in a floodplain. Am I not correct?
Well, perhaps all of it. It came close to being flooded a couple of years
Right.
ago.
Exactly. So, I mean, and one of the reasons for those with long memories, one of the reasons the West Don lands and sections of the port lands lay brownfield fallow for so many years is because they're in a floodplain. In fact, actually, large sections of the St. Lawrence Market neighborhood would not, under present floodplain rules, have been able to be developed redeveloped in the late 70s when they began being redeveloped. So floodplain rules are something sort of vaguely akin to transportation rules that Ron was just detailing. Floodplain rules have also increased in their stringency and their climate change focus in recent years. So while you might well be able to, sit at the Brian Iler Memorial Tavern in the in the expanded Toronto Island Park and enjoy the lagoon and watch the kayaks go by, just as you can have certain uses in the existing portlands prior to, the creation of Villiers Island, which also involves a great deal of flood protection and mitigation. You can't build townhouses, and you can't even build permanent residential structures in areas. So, yeah, that is a thing. I saw a hand up a minute ago. Sorry, I was keeping an eye on you. Oh, Susan. Here we go. If you could unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, hi. Actually, it was less of a question and more of just adding to what you just finished saying about the Portlands. Because I mean, as you know, that is also on floodplain lands, and they've had to do millions and millions of dollars of
1.2 billion, Susan.
yeah. So I mean, the only thing I would say is that sometimes, whether it's seeming reasonable or not, the will of our premier supersedes maybe pragmatic logic. So I mean, yeah, that's all I'll say to that.
Thanks. Well, actually, it's interesting because, Brian and I were just talking about that a couple of days ago, weren't we, Brian, right? And the fact of the matter is, if you are seized on the housing crisis, if you believe that we should be increasing density intensification in already built up parts of the city, parts of Ontario, like the city of Toronto, rather than, say, building on the Greenbelt, there is plenty of land adjacent nearby in the Portlands that could have, in fact, Waterfront Toronto is already going through an upzoning discussion on Villiers Island. There's plenty of land to accommodate tens of thousands, 100,000 people easily without compromising or building housing on a complicated piece of flood-prone land on the island, right? So I think that, as we discussed, Brian, right? There's not a need for it, right? You can accommodate, you could add 100,000 people to downtown Toronto without touching the islands. And you could actually do it without building 100-story towers either. Sorry, Ed, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess that I thought I would jump in and say that to my mind, this is just simply something that has to be thrown into the mix and studied. It may well be that parkland is the best use. It's conceivable that there is housing on the island now, actually, at the other end. It's presumably not impossible. Is it politically sellable? Is it a good idea? Does it make any sense? We've had Harbor City as a proposal in the past, which was a housing related kind of proposal. It seems to me that what the city ultimately should do, and what the responsible thing to do, is to look into various possibilities and the pros and cons of them, and possibly consider that as well. What the actual official planning documents say is that if the airport closes, that the land should be parks or a mixture of parks and housing. So it's something that would have to be examined. Many people would hate the idea. It may be a terrible idea. I don't know, but I think we should not absolutely rule it out as impossible.
Well, just as you would with an individual EA, right? Environmental assessment. You look at all the options, if only to thoroughly investigate and dismiss some of them, right?
Right.
So I think that's a fair comment. Sanford, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I'm fine.
Okay. Okay, let's just check the time. It's 8:17. We can hang around for a few more minutes if people would like to. Do we have any other comments or questions? Or Pam, hello again, Pam. If you could unmute yourself again.
Got it right this time.
Yes.
Two questions. Environmental impact of the infill. Infill's really, dredging and infilling around the city is very hard to do. I can just imagine that this would be very hard to get past major infill. Now, maybe political would prevail over the fish habitat and so on, but I'm just wondering about that. And then I was thinking about Waterfront, our park, Toronto Island Park, is underfunded and needs more money. It's very tired. The city doesn't have any money. So developing this huge 215 acres of land is going to be costly. Now, it seems to me that somewhere in the mix of development, you would have to have some income generated somehow. And, like Thermi Spa, or, you would have to have, for instance, Waterfront Toronto has done their build out by building buildings and generating income from developers and so on. So I see that as being a potential element to these 215 acres of land. That's my two pieces: infill and cost for development.
So Pam, on infill, you're talking about extending the runways into the bay and into the harbor.
Yes.
Yes, I agree. It's difficult, expensive, and will require lots of various kinds of approvals. On the other issue of how do we finance this? Berlin has really let the airport they shut down in the city center just be, and it's used by a lot of people, just a place to walk through. So you don't have to spend a lot of money to make it work. I think Tom Basai's proposal would require a lot of money to recreate those lagoons and walkways and so on. And there may be investors who'd like to build restaurants and build maybe a hotel over there. Those kind of things could generate some money. We do want to avoid the mistake that was made with Harbourfront Corporation of thinking that the development along the waterfront would pay for Harbourfront. It didn't and doesn't. I think this should be another federal government initiative for the benefit of Toronto. The way Harbourfront, if it had been done right, was supposed to be, and certainly the way Granville Island has been in Vancouver, a gift from the government of Canada to the people of Toronto. That's what I would see it. I agree, the city doesn't have the funds.
Well, as a believer in innovation, I would say call for proposals and see what people come up with.
Right. Well, I mean, there are many parks, aren't there, Sanford? I mean, there are many areas where there are money generating activities in parks, right? In cities, there are that provide some ongoing revenue and operational revenue. I know in terms of the capital costs, but I mean, there are, as Brian pointed out, there are expensive ways of doing things and there are less expensive ways of doing things. And the other thing is, of course, is you don't have to do it all at once. You can scale, you can scale it and plan it over time. And I mean, certainly there are undoubtedly, even if you are committed to a parks vision, as Brian pointed out, as Tom's vision, there are buildings there that can be repurposed, and there are activities that are commensurate with a park and recreational things. I mean, after all, Central Park has money generating activities in it. And if you've ever eaten at Tavern on the Green, you pretty much have to cash in an RRSP to pay for lunch there. Patricia and Aaron raised their hand. If you could unmute yourself.
Edward, thank you. Patricia's not here, but I'll join as Aaron.
Hi, Aaron.
Yeah, thank you very much. And my camera is on the blink, so my apologies if I look black, but I am here. One thing that I've listened to the discussion seems to be the commercial traffic aspect of airports and moving the island to Pearson as one consideration. But Pearson, if I understand it correctly, is one of the busiest air traffic schools that's available now for private pilots to learn their flying skills. We used to have an airport at Leaside's closed. We used to have Buttonwood, it closed. What do pilots do in the history of Canada who are going to become pilots? We're going to run out of people who have any ability to get their education if we don't have a pilot school going. Is there any consideration of keeping the airport going because of its educational aspect? Thank you.
I would say that it's a pretty darned expensive piece of land to use for pilot training. There's Oshawa and there's Hamilton and there are other airports around the Greater Toronto area that are more suited for that kind of use than downtown Toronto. Also note that the private planes that are used to train on, a lot of them are use leaded gasoline and spewing lead in their exhaust. And they're louder than a lot of the bigger planes. So it's not something that fits very well with a recreational and residential area.
Well, and as Brian, you spoke to that earlier, I mean, optimistic people would say that in a decade or two, we may well have viable electric private planes, small planes powered by electric engines. That is something that people are actively working on right now. But to Brian's point, those are not, those are not Dreamliners. They aren't they aren't large scale passenger jets. They still aren't really available. You can't go buy one. They are concept, or there are some so it's probable that in 20 or 30 years people will be able to buy small electric planes. But again, as Brian said, it's awfully expensive land, which is another reason why, of course, other cities have gotten rid of their downtown airports or their central town airports, because they're not, they don't produce the same kind of revenue, and nor do they anchor an area. I mean, I know, I don't, Sanford, if you have you done work on this, or you're familiar with work on this? I can't think of it off the top of my head, but I know there's a lot of studies that have shown, the value of parks, right, in urban contexts, right? And can you speak to that at all?
Well, put it this way. I mean, the fact that parks generally don't charge admission fees make it sort of hard to come up with an economic criterion. You sort of have to find ways to get around that and sort of and estimate values. But I'm, how would I put it? I'm sure that the value of parks is substantial, if not immeasurable.
Yeah, I mean, if you just counted, Central Park's value to Manhattan based on the rents paid by Tavern on the Green and the Carousel, I'm sure you wouldn't get an adequate picture of its value to the city. And yet,
I just thought I'd say that I did a double header with Gil Penalosa, the mayoral candidate for York Neighborhood Association, and one of the things that came out of our discussion was the idea that there might, because it's kind of interesting and perhaps even necessary that there be some discussion of what could be there or what could be done. It might be nice to have a kind of a design competition or have different people submit ideas as to what might conceivably be done at a high level there, and to just see what came out of it. To get international designers and people all over the world might be interested. I mean, it's a large chunk of urban land, and it's a tabula rasa. You could sort of see what might work. So that to me would be a good way to get people talking about it and kind of excited, because I think the way to look at it is it's kind of an exciting thing to think about for our city. It could be something really quite new and quite different. It could lead our whole downtown in a wholly different direction in a kind of exciting way if it happens. But we should really have a bunch of options in front of us, and we should talk about the pros and cons of all of these options. Many people have raised excellent points about the kind of thing that would be good or not good there.
I mean, I agree totally, but the process should be much more open than the process that led to the Therme Spa proposal at Ontario Place.
Well, that's setting the bar fairly low, Sanford.
I think that you didn't need to have consultation because it was so obvious that a big spa was needed that there was just no need for any discussion.
Well, in terms of next steps, so again, I mentioned that Brian Bowens from the city has been in the process. The city will be engaging in a conversation about this. We don't have a specific timeline on that, but we've been assured that it's in the works. We at Waterfront for All are absolutely happy to have further conversations on this topic, we might consider inviting some young architects or planners to come up with ideas for what could be done there. That might be something we might like to talk about. That might be a fun event. And speaking of events, though, I've shared with you that our next event is May 7th. That's a week today at Bathurst Quay. And the aforementioned, wearing a slightly different hat, Brian Bowen will be leading us on a walkabout of the changes and developments at Bathurst Quay. And so that's going to be Tuesday, May 7th at 6:30 p.m. in person at Ireland Park. In person. We're very excited. It's our first in-person event that we've done since the before time. So we're very excited about that. We will, of course, also be putting up at some point. I confess we've fallen a little bit behind. The trouble about, unfortunately, our highly paid staff, which is non-existent, has fallen a bit behind in posting videos of our previous events. But we do, in the fullness of time, post the recordings of our events at our website. And if you want to support us, we have a very modest budget, but we do, things like paying for Zoom and Nation Builder, which runs our website, allows us to reach out and contact you. We things like that, and we also hope to do more events in person in the second half of the year. It does in fact cost a bit of money. So I'm just going to put a link in the chat and probably follow up with an email to all of you, basically asking you for money if you have any money to spare. So donations are always welcome, and we're thrilled that we did have 140 people with us this evening, and we're thrilled you all came. And I think on behalf of all of us, and thank you very much, Sanford, for joining us this evening. And thank you all for your questions and comments. And I think we will wish you adieu and hope to see many of you out in the real world on Tuesday, May 7th at 6:30 p.m. at Island Park. Thank you very much, and good night.
Thank you. Good night.